Okay.
I'm almost, it takes a few seconds and I have to turn off something and then we can go live. I have to turn off something and then we can go. All right. Okay. So, I think we are live. So, hi. This is Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, and I'm having this evening a very interesting conversation. We've already started emotions flowing, so that's a good sign. As we get ready to talk about famine. And I have two guests with me so far, and another one who will be with us in a few minutes, I think. First, let me introduce someone I've known the longer, and that is Mustafa Koch, who is a sociology professor at Ryerson University and an old friend. I think both because you did your PhD work at U of T, and I don't know whether that's when we got acquainted, Mustafa, but at any rate, I feel I've known you forever, and you're a specialist in food security. And so when I have trouble trying to find other people who know a thing or two about food security, I know that I should call you. And indeed got me started today with a very great new connection, new friend. And I'm going to have to read Haroon Akram-Lodhi. Is that how you pronounce your name? Good. I was trying to explore a minute ago where this name came from, and he says he's Scottish. Well, good. That's really wonderful to have a Scot on our panel this evening. And he is a professor of economics and international development studies at Trent University. And he is editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. So his interest is also in food. Originally, we were talking a little bit about the importance of women farmers, and that seems to be a focus of his. So it's wonderful to have you both here. Now, where do we start? I would like to pick up, let's start, maybe we can start with where Mustafa and I almost, I guess we agree, but I was, I think Mustafa took exception to my statement that I'm looking for excellent public policy proposals that will reduce the possibility or the risk of famine in the world in general. And he immediately countered that with saying, we don't need any more policies, we need politics. So can you elaborate on that and pick up where you left off, Mustafa, in explaining why that kind of lively rhetoric of inspiring us all to get more active and committed is so important now.
Policies have been developed by governments, like by states or different organizations to determine the direction that they would follow. And they, you can even have your own policy. You may say, I'm not going to eat sugar anymore, and that's your private policy. And then you may have a state policy, and you may say, hey, I am not going to dump on third world countries, and I'll engage in fair trade, or I'll engage in sustainable agriculture. And these are policies, and all governments do that. And in recent years, we now even have international level governance, like international organizations, and they are trying to, or we also have like international agreements that try to bind nation states in their actions. So these are good things. But what happens in reality is that those policies may mean very little if they are not supported with the right politics. Mm-hmm. Okay, and politics is really this art of negotiating about which side is right, and usually the powerful dominant segments of the society at the end have far more influence in influencing both policy and implementation of policy. So that's why I'm kind of hesitant in raising my expectations that with the right policies we could solve world's problems. Like, for example, as I mentioned earlier, Canada has adopted a National Action Plan on Food Security in 1998 in response to the World Food Summit of 1996. It just remained for just a couple of weeks alive, and then it was forgotten at a website of Agriculture Agri-Food Canada.
Yeah.
It was never implemented. And now, so that's why I'm saying, yeah, sure, you can have the best policy, but implementation process is important. That requires political organizing, political struggle for making sure that you will have those. Like elect democracy. On paper, it's a wonderful thing. But if you do not defend your democratic rights, or if you are living in an authoritarian state, democracy in paper, like you may have the best constitution in the world, but means nothing. You can be ruled by an idiot, by a buffoon, and, what can you do?
This sounds like a man who's, I don't want to use the word, burned out, like you fought about.
No, absolutely not. I am not burned out. I'm just basically saying that we really have to have the right politics. Without the right politics, we won't be able to solve the problems of the world.
Sure. Metta, maybe I can jump in on this because I agree with Mustafa on this point quite fundamentally. So, we've come together this evening to talk about the issue of famine, but we have to realize, I think, that we live in a very unique and particular historic period when it comes to this issue of famine, something which far and away the vast majority of people in Canada don't understand. Yeah, and that is that historically famines were caused by weather events. They were caused by floods, they were caused by drought, they were caused by natural calamities. However, over the course of the past 100 years, the role of weather events in producing famines has really taken a back seat. And what's been driving famines has been the way in which they have been created, politically created, in order to achieve certain political ends. If we think about the great famines of the 20th century, we can think about the famine around the forced collectivization in agriculture in the Soviet Union, or the famine that followed the Great Leap Forward in China, or the famine that followed the Cultural Revolution in China. These were all man-made events which had political origins. And if we think about the great places currently which are threatened with famine, we have to zone in immediately on the situation in Yemen, where we have a politically driven war, the situation in South Sudan, where we have huge political instability amongst warring elites trying to take control of a state. You have huge political instability driving famine in northeastern Nigeria on the border with Chad, again, driven very much by political instabilities tied down to elites. And then you have political instabilities driving famine in parts of Somalia. So what's common across all of these things is the role of politics, particularly regressive politics, that's prepared to use food shortages and famine as a tool of politics. And I think where this really reaches its most highly crafted expression, something we never think about, was actually World War II. Because at heart, World War II in Europe was a war over access to food. The reason the fascists invaded the Soviet Union was because the principal plan was to turn Ukraine into a breadbasket of Nazi Germany. for Britain to be able to survive, they require, and for the Soviet Union to survive, they required those food stocks from the United States, and so that became another theater of conflict. The thing, when we start to recognize that famine is now a politically driven event, we're led to some very uncomfortable truths. Firstly, that the role of weather events and natural disasters in producing famine, this is increasingly a thing of the past. There is certainly the case that in some parts of South Sudan, Somalia, that climate change is exacerbating processes that are at work, but it's politics which is driving it. And these weather-driven famines, if they're a thing of the past, we actually face a much more uncomfortable present. And that uncomfortable present is that where there is famine in the world, it's a consequence of a particularly regressive politics which uses it for political ends, number one. But then secondly, and more fundamentally, even where there are famines in the contemporary world, they are extraordinarily less severe than they have been historically. Where you could have had millions dying, you now have thousands. And of course, thousands are far too many, but it's the reduction in the order of magnitude is quite remarkable. But this then leads to something which is even more worrying, because if widespread famine is now measured in the thousands rather than the millions, and yet we live in a world in which 1.3 billion people go systematically hungry every single night, the problem that we face is a systemic problem of hunger, a problem in which too many people are excluded from getting access to food which is in their local markets because they don't have the money to buy it. We live in a world in which the food system that we have created is one which creates and perpetuates hunger. And so, focusing upon famine is important in terms of thinking about conflict and the way in which conflict shapes people's entitlements to food. But for the vast majority of the hungry people of the world, day in and day out, hunger is a normal part of their lives because of the way in which our food system operates. And then that's where the politics comes in. There's a need for a different kind of food politics around that.
Okay, beautiful. Everything that I've been reading lately sounds very much aligned with what both of you have just said. I've been reading just today Alex de Waal's new book called Mass Starvation. And the last thing I was reading was Rhoda Howard Hassman's book. I can't remember, State Crimes of Famine or something like that. I don't remember the title, but it's a new book. Both of them arguing that the thing that we need to do is recognize that that starvation is not something that just happens. It's something that people do to each other, and that this is a crime, and that what we need to do is criminalize this kind of action, any kind of activity, political action that is taken for the sake of actually depriving people of food. That is on the order of a political action that is a crime. What I hear you saying, though, is that even at the everyday level of malnutrition or undernutrition, that people who are hungry as a chronic problem, that too often is a political, the solutions are political.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's go with that, because that is I think that does run counter to what most people would assume. And then the question is, how do you conscientize people about an issue that hasn't troubled them? I find this all the time as a peace activist. I say we have to do something to get rid of nuclear weapons, and that means getting people upset about nuclear weapons enough to actually force the government to do something. So I think really the background condition that we're dealing with is, how do we change public opinion and public emotion to the extent of getting people troubled by and engaged with an issue that hasn't been an issue for them before? Is that compatible with what you're saying, either of you?
Well, I think it's, if I can jump in. I think it's compatible with what I'm saying, but so I think we have to step back a little bit. If we go back to, my late teens and my 20s, Thunder Bay. This is 1970s. And what happens in the 1970s in Thunder Bay is that we open our first food bank in the 1970s. Now, the thing about food banks in Canada, a land which produces way more food than could possibly be eaten by our population, is that they've become normalized over the course of the past 50 years. They're an everyday part of what we expect civil society to do for food insecure populations. No one turns around politically and says that people's lack of access to food actually violates their human rights, and we're supposed to have governments which pay attention to our human rights, and that by violating our human rights to food, our governments are actually in violation of certain conventions which they freely signed on to. So we've normalized food insecurity here in Canada to the point where we can see homeless people dying on the streets of major urban areas, and we can stigmatize people that go into food banks, and yet so many of us need them to manage on a regular basis. So what we really need to start with is by challenging this whole sort of intellectual approach, which allows the normalization of food insecurity on our very doorsteps as being acceptable. Because when I was a kid, it wasn't acceptable. And that changed. Yeah, that's the thing that changed. We need to go, in some way, senses, we have to go back to the future, a different kind of way of thinking about these things. That people have a certain right to a stake in their society, and these include fundamental basic economic rights which shouldn't be violated. And those economic rights certainly encompass a right to food which Canada signed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We signed it in 1948, and it's something which, over the course, as I've said, of the past 50 years, we've allowed to become systematically violated.
Okay, I would like to know just a factual matter. Is there a treaty? I know that the right to food is, I guess, considered part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm not sure. I think it must be, because
it is.
But is there any kind of treaty or any kind of law that would say that anybody is systematically depriving others of food intentionally as a political gesture of action, that is a crime and should be prosecuted?
It wouldn't be seen as a crime and be prosecuted because you're dealing with international conventions and covenants. It would be seen as a violation of people's rights. Those rights can be addressed in international fora, but of course they're not binding.
Canada has also signed on several treaties, and constitutionally we also recognize the right to food, but there's nothing there to implement it. There's nothing there to defend people's right to food. There were attempts to in some court cases, but was just like marginal. It's never been implemented, and but just think about it. Since as Haroon was mentioning about this legitimation, or like the public insensitivity towards hunger and food insecurity, it's the product of 1980s, 1990s. As we went through this neoliberal restructuring of the economy and this restructuring of the state, we also were bombarded by this same neoliberal ideology that blamed the poor on the street,
blamed the victim,
blamed the welfare bums. That in 1996, when Mike Harris went out and overnight reduced social assistance programs by almost 23%, there was no outrage, no moral panic, no, like, people didn't go out and saying, we cannot accept this, we are a humane society, how could we do this to the most powerless elements of our society, people were in fact were happy. And when it was combined with removal of rent control, middle class was even happier because they thought they could increase the rent for the basement apartment. So, and when you combine rent control, removal of rent controls with removal of the decline of social assistance, and at the same time decline on social housing programs from 1994, 1995 onwards, both federal and provincial levels, then you are talking about famine for a segment of the society.
Yeah.
And we could not even feel outraged about this. And if we would now talk about, if we would get outraged, if we would be outraged about 40% of food insecurity in Nunavut, people will think that we are too emotional.
Yeah.
You know, this is the reality. You know, that's why we really need to understand that we got to, yes, I agree, we need to work towards a food policy that is going to defend people's right to food, that is going to defend our right to sustainable agriculture, farmers' right to sustainable agri-food system. We like to recognize people's right to healthy, safe, and nutritious foods. But at the same time, we need to develop some political awareness to make sure that these will be implemented, and people who violate them will not, they don't have to go to jail.
Yeah.
They don't have to go to jail, but they should be thrown out of government, and we should be outraged that these are not recognized. So I think we really need to. That's why I'm just like pitching on this politics of food instead of food policy. There are wonderful developments, like in the Canadian case right now, that the last year, for example, federal government announced that they are going to develop a food policy for Canada. That's you can, if you will go to the Agriculture Agri-Food Canada website, and it's a wonderful, hopeful sign. For the first time, we may have a national food policy for Canada, but we, at the same time, we also need to be publicly aware, because nothing is going to give us, and no single policy is going to make us food secure, food sovereign, if we will not have the right politics to defend our right to food, our right to food security and food sovereignty.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now, how do we get that kind of politics?
Well, I mean, I think, Metta, that I hate to say it, but it's staring us in the face. I mean, if you look at where right to food activism is located in Canada at its most fundamental around issues of food security, you're looking at Indigenous peoples' movements across the country where they recognize systemic food insecurity in their communities, and also a lack of access to historically, culturally appropriate foods, and the impacts that has got for their communities in terms of diet and health, and in terms of educational outcomes. All of these things are well recognized by Indigenous movements across the country. So we've actually already got the social movement there. It's just that, you know, Canadians need to wake up and realize that the kind of challenge to their aggressive politics that needs to be addressed to deal with issues around food insecurity and famine in this country are coming out of Indigenous communities. And we need to think about the way in which we can work with those communities as allies, which allow them to take their claims forward in ways that benefit everyone. That's the future.
I hadn't made that connection. That's very interesting that the Indigenous, you know, the emphasis on the rights to food come largely from Indigenous communities. What I was thinking in terms of is what kinds of, I think in terms of policies, you'll have to please excuse me, but I'm thinking, for example, the policy of adopting a basic income a guaranteed right to a certain amount of money that would be at least subsistence income for everybody. I've been told that it's a lot better, instead of running social assistance programs where poor people have to go talk to a social worker and get approval for everything they do, that it works a lot better simply to give people money, a certain amount of cash regularly, and they take care of themselves and manage their own affairs very well. Thank you much. And if that's the case, wouldn't that also apply to the notion of giving a guaranteed basic income to all Canadians? And let's not just stop at the borders of Canada. If it's a good idea here, wouldn't it also be a good idea elsewhere?
I'm not quite sure if income policies would solve the problems. It's at the moment definitely better than social assistance programs, because they are at least in the 1980s, 1990s, we weren't managing them effectively. But if we will just give a basic income to people, but if we do not have other protections in terms of available public housing, in terms of the commodified nature of food, the next day food prices will go up. The next day housing prices, rents will go up. As soon as every month you raise the minimum allowance to the people, you will have a tremendous inflation in terms of rental rates, housing rates, and food prices. And I mean, the money you are giving to people will not actually go into their pocket, will go into the pockets of those people who do not need that money. Okay? So for that reason, we need to problematize the commodified nature of food. We need to talk about other aspects of what we call the commons, the civic commons, and the right to education. And you cannot even talk about right to food, without right to education, without right to housing, without right to health care, so these are basic human rights. And we have increasingly commodified, increasingly privatized these so-called commons, like the pastures. We lost them. And we have to go out and start reclaiming them. And we have to start talking about our basic rights. When I came to Canada in 1979, I was paying $600 as a foreign graduate student for my annual tuition. And then it became $1,200 when I went to University of Toronto. And right now, foreign graduate students are paying $28,000 to $30,000. Canadian undergraduates in Ontario are paying over $7,000 for their tuition. And what had happened? Are they getting any better education? And are they, in my university, we have a food bank. Our students do not have enough to feed themselves, so they just go and eat from the food bank. And we are talking about one of the most advanced industrialized countries that is exporting food all around the world. So we really need to understand that we have to work together to bring all these changes. Otherwise, nothing will happen.
Okay, let's work together. I'm here. Tell me what to do, sir.
Well, no, Metta, there's something we have to realize, which is implicit in what Mustafa is saying, and that is that what he's saying in terms of challenging this matrix in which we expect that we're going to have to buy food and we're going to have the money to do it, that challenging this, in some ways it sounds quite revolutionary, quite radical, but in fact it's not at all revolutionary or radical. It's actually going back to the kinds of social arrangements that communities existed on for tens of thousands of years and which were only broken very, very recently. So here in Canada, particularly out in the Canadian West, up until only 100, 125 years ago, communities were built around the idea that everyone in the community had a right as a member of a community to a minimum standard of living. And what that meant was that when someone didn't have enough, other members of the community chipped in. And if that meant that there was a problem with their crops or with their livestock, the other members of the community stepped in. So there was this reciprocity between members of communities, which societies accepted. And it was only, as I say, 100, 125 years ago that started to erode here in Canada. In other parts of the world, it's even much more recent. I mean, in some parts of Eastern and Southern Africa where I go, this notion of reciprocity within communities, it's only eroded in the past 30 years. The idea that we're members of a community and all of the members of that community have a right to a certain minimum standard, and that means you don't need to have the money to buy the food. There's a way in which you can get it without having that money at all. That's the way in which we're going to start thinking about challenging the inability of far too many Canadians and other people around the world to be able to obtain their subsistence. I do think that what you were talking about in terms of a universal basic income, I've written about this. I hate to say it, I've written about it for more than 35 years, so I'm a very strong believer in it. But that, as Mustafa says, will not necessarily challenge the processes underpinning food insecurity. What we need to do is recognize that there are certain things which people should have as a right, and these rights are already codified in covenants and conventions of which our government is a signatory. That these rights that we have include the fact that we shouldn't necessarily have to go over and fork out $1 to be able to get something. That our right to a share of the social wealth of the country is part and parcel of our citizenship. And that's how we get it.
But how is that different from, how are we going to share that way? Am I going to say to the people, come here, in my kitchen, there's a fridge, help yourself? How do we organize this reciprocity and mutuality? I'm all for it. I just don't know step by step how we're going to implement it.
Just think about this. How much are you paying for your health care in Ontario?
Do
you remember the time when we used to, when we had deductions from our health care?
Yeah.
For our health care, for OHIP? It was removed, so we don't pay anything anymore. Imagine public transit. I pay $3.25 for a ticket, okay? But imagine you don't pay. The city basically makes public transit a priority for all of its citizens. It's a basic human right, and it provides basic public transit. It's free. I mean, just what it will do, imagine what it will do to the city in terms of in terms of transit, but I'm not suggesting current transit, I'm talking about serious public investment in decent public transit.
Okay, now you're saying something like that would happen with food, that we wouldn't have food banks, but we would have grocery stores like we do now, and people just don't pay. They bring.
There are different mechanisms. There are, like, for example, in UK and some other European countries, they have these social kind of social grocery stores, and where you can just go as a member, buy things that are far below the market value, and you don't have to go to a food bank. It's just like it's kind of a system. There are also, like in Vancouver, in Ontario, there are experimenting with alternative forms of community food security projects or alternative forms of food banks, food hubs. But there are multiple innovations right now. In Brazil, for example, they adopted some very innovative solutions, and in fact, their cost to the public system was far lower than social assistance programs. Social assistance programs. So, like when there is a will, if we will publicly prioritize them as a solution, I think we can come up with very creative solutions. We are very smart people, but just think about why we cannot deliver clean energy. Like this is something maybe easier for people to recognize. Everybody is talking about the need for clean energy, and we are almost in the middle of a constitutional crisis between Alberta and British Columbia about one of the most toxic forms of fuel that had to be transported all the way from Alberta, from the tar sands to China, using pipelines. And we do not even recognize how insane, how bizarre, how cost inefficient this system is, this whole tar sands projects. But and everybody is talking about clean energy, and instead of investing in clean energy, we wasted billions of dollars in tar sands, and we are now trying to spend even more money to transport these tar sands. And in the meanwhile, we are doing practically nothing for clean energy. We even removed some of the available subsidies for individuals to build, sun, solar energy panels on their houses, so that they could produce energy that they need. And we could just do those subsidies. We are not even doing that anymore. So these are things we have to ask ourselves. What do we need to do as a society collectively to reduce food insecurity, to provide clean energy, to remove environmental toxins from our lives? So these are and then we can actually come up with probably far more effective policies. But we really need to think and talk together to find solutions.
I mean, I think, Metta, the thing that Mustafa is really nicely pointing out, I think, is that, on the one hand, it's a very common refrain that people will come back to people like Mustafa and myself, and they will say, well, what's your answer? What's your solution? Tell me the answer. Tell me what we need to do. And then we can think about whether we're going to do it. Now, the thing about it is that expecting Mustafa or myself to come up and say, this is the answer. This is an unrealistic thing, because we're just two men sitting in our studies, right? Our social imagination has been neutered over the course of the past 30 years. And it's very difficult for us to think outside of the box. But there are ways of thinking outside of the box, and government has an important role in facilitating the ability of people to think outside the box. So, for example, if we look at more climate-friendly forms of agriculture, we've created a food system which contributes minimally 25% of greenhouse gas emissions to global warming, possibly as much as 35%. And so we've created a food system which feeds us, yes, but which degrades the very environment within which our food is produced. Now, alternatives to that food system exist. Agroecological sustainable farming practices are well known to be extremely productive around the world. And yet when we look at private sector research into ways of making farming more productive, it all goes into this failed food system model based upon industrial forms of agriculture, which are seeking to extract resources from our environment and basically plundering the environment. And almost nothing goes into far more sustainable forms of agriculture. And so, we're not actually we're not making sure that our government puts our money where our mouth is. If we want to think about alternatives, We need to start thinking about how we're going to finance the research into thinking about how those alternatives could work. It certainly is the case that across Southern Ontario, there are literally thousands of farmers who are challenging existing food systems by producing things in much more climate-friendly ways, and in a way which allows them to have not enough, but a living. You know, they could certainly be doing better because I've met far too many of them, but they manage to get by. It can be tight, but they manage. If we start thinking about leveraging the imagination of these people that we have working among us, this is the way in which we can start to think about alternative ways in which we're going to deliver food to people that don't have it, both here within Canada, but also around the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the issues, like when we were talking about right to food, when we are talking about right to food, we are not just talking about people's right to eat. We are also talking about people's right to make their living in agriculture, make their living in the food system. Like if the farmer cannot feed himself or his family, if the farmer is going to a food bank to feed his family, and this is happening in various parts of Ontario, in Canada, and then we are not talking about right to food. We are condemning these people who are actually providing millions of dollars, who own millions of dollars equipment, and who owns millions of dollars of land, and who are living in poverty. And can't we collectively think about a better mechanism to support the livelihood of these units so that they can contribute to food security of this country? Can't we develop food policies that would encourage these people connect their resources to the cities? Here in the cities, even in prime season, we are getting products from all around the world. Like in the prime apple season, I have apples from Argentina, I have apples from South Africa, from Washington State. I mean, and can't we at least in some of those areas where we have our local strength, support our local food economies? These are things we have to collectively think, and these will require investment, and these will also require, as Haroon is saying, decent, good research, good data. And unfortunately, we do not have that data. We really do not have the evidence to support the so-called right policies. Because when I try to defend a solution that is implemented in Brazil, people will say, but that's Brazil, that's not Canada, that's very different. Then I say, how about Holland? They say, but Holland is very different. Then I say, and I say, then can you please show me some research that you have done that why this cannot be implemented in Canada? They have nothing. Because
let me ask about what you're talking about it for. Let's go back to Brazil and Holland and these practices that they've developed that I think you really want us to promote here. Can you elaborate on exactly how they do whatever it is they're doing that because I want some concrete, specific suggestions of what to do to solve our problems. I hear your frustration. When I called you burned out, I didn't mean to insult you. I meant to say that I too get to the point of being so frustrated that I think, I feel like pounding my head against the wall because my energy goes into trying to get other people to be upset about an issue that they don't care enough about. So, but I think the solution to my problem is, when I feel that frustrated, is to get a little bit more specific about what steps I think we need to take and what direction we need to move toward. You say you don't want policies because policies are not adopted.
No, I didn't say I don't want policies. I said we need good policies, but I said policies mean nothing if we do not have the right politics to implement those policies.
But let's talk about what policies should be adopted and why you think they're important. And then I will put my energy into trying to get other people to agree with you that these are the policies we really want to get.
But this is not unique to me. Like some very good people have been working on this for decades. And there are there is not a single policy, that there is not a single 1, 2, 3 each points that will solve our food system. Our food system is complex, Metta.
Okay, let's take them.
Problems require complex solutions.
If it's going to be 10 policies, then let's enumerate what 10 policies.
Organizations such as Food Secure Canada, and I will tell people to go to Food Secure Canada's website, and it is a civil society organization that has been fighting for food security in Canada for since 2005. Go to Food Secure Canada's website, and they have what they call the People's Food Policy Project, and they have some very, very elaborate recommendations, policy recommendations.
Like what? Tell me.
Canadian Federation of Agriculture developed its own policies. National Farmers Union have various policy recommendations to support family farming. So there are multiple solutions. Some of them are targeting our agri-food system to make them more sustainable, to make them more resilient, to make them more lively, to support the livelihood of the farmers and farm workers in those who are working in the fields. There are policies that deal with urban food insecurity. There are policies that deal with Aboriginal and Northern food insecurities. Yeah. And so not one single solution. What we need is to look at the complexity of the issue. The problem in agri-food system, the system is so complex, so multifaceted, and so far we have been only thinking within silos, and we are basically, and most often our agri-food policy has been focusing only on agricultural exports, and it's not going to solve our problems. We need to think about the big picture. And I am not going to, if you are going to insist to show you 10 things, I will not, because I will refuse. It will be insult to everybody's intelligence. And I strongly recommend people to go to Food Secure Canada's website to look at some very sophisticated food policy documents. And federal government right now has been doing some critical thinking, and they have done some extensive consultations since last summer. They have been hearing people from till early September. They have been hearing people from sea to sea, and lots of wonderful ideas are coming. So issue is not that we do not have lack of effective solutions. We have millions of solutions, but what we need is willingness to make a difference.
Okay, I'm sitting here willing, but I don't know what to do.
Okay. Let me just jump in, because Mustafa doesn't want to lay something down, but I'm prepared to lay something down.
Good.
So I will lay the one thing down, and it's fairly it can come across as being fairly abstract, but it's really quite fundamental. So I've already mentioned the fact that if we want to look at where we see hotbeds of food activism trying to challenge food insecurity across the country, we have to look towards Indigenous communities, which are at the forefront of trying to fight food insecurities across the country, whether they're urban communities in Winnipeg or Toronto, whether they're rural communities up in Nunavut. The thing about it is, however, is that the whole question around Indigenous people's relationship to their food is also part and parcel a question of Indigenous people's relationship to the land. And the land is absolutely at the heart of how our food system operates, and it's at the heart of how reconciliation starts in this country. Unless we actually deal seriously and concretely with issues around Indigenous dispossession from land, we will not get reconciliation in this country. The terms and conditions over which people access and control the use of land is absolutely fundamental to it. We've created a country in which the Indigenous population of the country, their reserves constitute 0.2% of the land area of the country. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable that we that Canadians don't realize the extent to which we have muscled the people off of their land and herded them in to these very small territories, which are by definition unsustainable. So what we need here in the country, in terms of both a policy to enhance, to address issues around food insecurity, generate more sustainable farming practices, and promote reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples, is some kind of very fundamental root and branch land reform. And the thing about it is, it's not that civil society movements don't recognize it beyond Indigenous populations. Canada's National Farmers Union does have a policy on land reform. As an organization of small and medium scale farmers, the National Farmers Union recognizes that Indigenous peoples have been systemically excluded from the land that was theirs, and something needs to be done about that. So unless we deal seriously with this issue of land reform here in Canada, we're not going to deal with the issues around food sovereignty and food justice.
Okay. All right. Now, this is a totally new idea to me. I have to admit, I never thought about it that way before, and I wouldn't know what to do tomorrow to support what you want to do. I guess I kind of want to know how to organize a campaign, if that's what you want to do, or...
Well, there's no, but Metta, the first thing you have to do is you have to start listening to what Indigenous people want in terms of a conversation around the land. Right? So it's not a question of us organizing, it's a question of us listening.
Yeah, and I would honestly tell people within Science for Peace to not to worry too much about effective food policy to save Canada or save the world. And what they can do actually through Science for Peace is linking with existing organizations that are working for better housing, that are working for clean energy, that are working for food security and food sovereignty in Canada, because they have some very good solutions. Yeah. If Science for Peace wants to go and invite these people and grab their ideas and implement and try to introduce these policies to support peace-related activity, peace around the world, then I think Science for Peace can be part of the bigger chain, because we really cannot, in isolation from the rest of all these social movements, can actually solve the world's problems as a civil society organization. We really need to link with them. We really need to learn from them. And instead of telling them what to do, we have to invite them to find out what we can do and how we can help them in their effort. And I think this is a noble solution, and I would encourage you to invite people from National Farmers Union, invite people from Food Secure Canada to find out what they are recommending, what they are doing, and help people around the world. And getting back to the original topic about famines, okay, which is where we started and we moved to Canadian territory, but we can also likewise we have significant contributions. We do not talk about, for example, the land grab that is going on around the world in sub-Saharan Africa, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Madagascar, in different parts of the world. Some of the commons that have been available and accessible to poor peasant families have been appropriated, privatized, and have been leased to rich countries from Gulf states or rich countries or rich funds for 7,500 year periods, so that they could just produce on this land. corn like corn for biofuel, or palm trees for biodiesel, and we are not even questioning this. This is a big peace problem when you push hundreds of thousands of people out of the commons where they could earn their living. They are sending them to the radical elements who are looking for soldiers to recruit.
That's true.
Because one of the biggest disasters in Central Africa, we are like, just think about this. We are sending our troops to Mali. Yeah. We are not even questioning why Mali, and what was our role there? What is our role in Mali?
Yeah.
And why we have so much unrest in Mali and Central Africa? Has it occurred to any one of us that it could be due to our involvement in Libya, destruction of the economy in Libya, creating terrible poverty and huge population movements throughout Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa? Have we ever questioned that? And we are the peace organization.
Okay. Well, now that's a segue, if I may. I want to take this as an opportunity to make the kind of link that I'm very concerned to making, which is that we have at least six threats to humankind that are so stupendous that each one of them could kill 1 billion people at a time, or even in civilization when it comes to something like nuclear war. And what we are doing in Science for Peace is organizing an effort to look at the connections among these six things. And I'm thinking of both war and weapons, and especially the nuclear war potential, and then global warming and famine, because famine is connected to war for sure. And we haven't made that connection clear enough here, maybe to the extent to which famine is really a weapon of war used deliberately now in order to injure or control or exert power over certain other populations. War, global warming, famine, pandemics, which are related to the health issues related to the war, related to global warming. All of these are interrelated. The possibility of a Chernobyl type or Fukushima kind of massive radiation exposure, which would wipe out a billion people if it melted down or something. And then now finally, the new threat on the block, cyber attacks. And all of these are to some extent interrelated causally. And they need to be, because they are a system, they need to be addressed comprehensively. So when you say we should look at land issues, we should look at human rights issues, yes, they are all connected. And I really, really think that we need to look at peace as a broader project of getting justice and environmental security under control. So on the 30th and the 31st of May, we will have a forum here in Toronto. And the purpose is to look at, as much as possible, the intersections between these six different issues, because the people working in these domains of concern tend to work in silos. And I think to some extent, the same solutions that would help in one area are the solutions that would help in one or two of the other areas. So if we can look for solutions that have, kill two birds with one stone, or 3 or 4 or 5 birds with one stone, we're I think in on the right track. So if you're interested in participating in this in another way, that is especially by attending, you can go to our website, which is called tosavetheworld.ca. And you'll see there the materials that we've already been accumulating, bibliographies, proposals. We have a column for discussions. we have lots and lots of videos because we've been making video lectures for years. And now I have these videos like we're doing tonight. Every Monday night, I'm having a conversation with some people about a serious global issue. And we put this on our website and we put it on Facebook on the Peace Magazine page. So you can, after we're through here, it's going to stay up on Facebook indefinitely. You can go there and take a look. Usually within a couple of weeks, we have 2,000 to 4,000 people who've taken a look. And I encourage you to look at some of the others that are there too. A whole slew of them are accumulating. Look at the website, tosavetheworld.ca, and there's a little place there where you can click if you want to register. The early bird price is $100 for 2 days, and it goes up to $120 after the 1st of May. And for students, it's even less, $40 and $50. Or unwaged people, you can come for cheaper. I want to get every one of those seats filled in that auditorium, because I think it's really important for us to have these conversations. 2 days of discussions among people who are working on very different issues, but all of them are connected. And so I hope I'll see you there. And also, I hope you come back next week, because I'm not quite sure what we're going to be talking about next week. It could be pandemics. I'm working on getting some people together for a conversation next week. Anyway, thank you. And we're 3 minutes after 9 o'clock, so it's time to say goodbye to people. And I want to thank both of you, my new friend and my old friend, who are participating in this extremely stimulating conversation, which makes me feel like going out and doing more. And I hope it will make a lot more other people will feel the same way. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Good night.
Night.